Hey guys, Luke Neumann with Neumann Films here, and first things first, I just want to thank you for purchasing this behind-the-scenes look at creating episode 1 of The Beacon. The idea to do an expansive behind-the-scenes tutorial that revolves around a piece of narrative work came from a tutorial we did about a year ago called How I Would Film It, a Dialogue Scene by a Waterfall. The premise was simple: film a dialogue scene next to a waterfall and try to take a look at every phase of production that it would take to pull this off. We're taking a very similar approach in this video. Now for this dialogue scene by a waterfall tutorial, the actual scene that we created to make the tutorial of was only about 45 seconds long. The tutorial itself was 15 minutes. So that kind of explains the length of this tutorial. Since the narrative piece that we're making it on is about 5 minutes long, this tutorial clocks in at just around 90 minutes. So without further ado, sit back and get comfortable. It's going to take a while to cover everything that went into episode 1. The idea for the Beacon has evolved over the past few years. As far as the costumes go, the main one featured in this that I want to talk about is the spacesuit. We had originally thought about making something ourselves, but in the end we went with this company called Global Effects, and it's a really great site. The people there are awesome, and they'll work with you with whatever your needs are, and the costumes that they have are really high quality. They have a huge selection of sci-fi and other genres, and I encourage you to go check out Global Effects and look at all their costumes. And this is the one we ended up going with. I really liked the sort of vintage look of it. It had the sci-fi look, but it also was a little worn, and I really liked how that looked out on the salt flats. Then for some of the props, we really started to look into Etsy.com and started to make relationships with quite a few people on there. And there's two in particular that I want to get into. One of them, his Etsy account is called Dark Haunt, and he made the gun for us. He basically customized a Nerf gun, and when I first saw the pictures, I kind of was thinking like, well, this is something we could do ourselves. If he's just customizing a Nerf gun, it can't be that hard. And then I got the actual gun, and for the price, the level of quality that he put into it was just amazing. Little etchings on the side of the gun, the paint job, the weathering, adding in LED lights, and all these different custom things that I asked for. He added weight to the gun so it felt heavier and would help the actors using it portray holding a gun a little more realistically. He did an amazing job, and he's actually now become kind of our go-to prop guy for the rest of the series. He's already creating some weapons for further episodes in the Beacon and some different props, and this guy is just really talented and he knows what he's doing. He's really nice and he's excited about the projects that he works on. So I encourage you to check him out, Dark Haunt on Etsy.com. The other person I want to talk about is the guy that made the virtual reality goggles that we use in the simulation sequence. His Etsy name is Two Horns United, and he makes a lot of these LED light goggles that just look awesome. He has some really interesting creations on his site, and he was also really nice to work with. I encourage you to check out his work as well. And Etsy in general is a great resource to go looking and come into contact with people that you can collaborate with for your productions going forward. The opening episode didn't necessarily have a script. It did for a few scenes, but there wasn't much dialogue in it. And so for me, it came down to just creating a world and creating the overall story arc for the entire series. And once I had that figured out and narrowed down, then what needed to happen in the prologue became clear. So it took a long time to just kind of figure out what the story of the Beacon was as a whole, and only then could I break down and figure out what needed to happen in the first episode. But really there wasn't a ton of planning. We just moved straight into production with the basic ideas of what needed to happen in the prologue in mind. Production on the first episode of The Beacon was broken down into two major shooting blocks. So for the opening scene where Pete is testing whether planets are habitable or not, we needed fairly diverse landscapes, and we wanted to stay within our home state of Oregon.
All right, we're out here in the Alvar Desert, even cooler than what I've seen in pictures. It's just a great location. Salt flats pretty much as far as the eye can see, and then mountains shoot right up out of it. The clouds today are amazing. So we're about to start filming our first scenes of the Beacon. We have to drive across these salt flats, and there's wet spots that we could get stuck in. So what we have to do is we have to navigate our way. We'll drive slowly, we'll have people get out and kind of scout ahead and walk on it, and just, we're gonna kind of have to zigzag across these salt flats to get to our location. So since we can't do the water, we'll go back, and let's say your destination is now that mountain, which isn't a bad secondary option.
Yeah.
So instead of the wet salt flats, we're gonna go with the complete white,
Okay.
because that's a equally cool alien look, I think.
Right.
So let's just head on back.
All right. So
We know we can drive fast too, so
Yeah. Cool.
let's go.
So once we found a spot that was dry in a fairly large area, we started to get some shots.
So you step on the ground, you know, maybe like stop and like look down. Take in the surroundings a little bit, look around, and we'll just do it all in one shot. And then you pick up the thing and you start testing. You're about to venture where no man has gone before.
Good.
We shot this entire sequence on the Red Epic in 5K, and we filmed on Kawa 2X PL mount anamorphic lenses.
2, go. Go.
I really enjoyed the look that these lenses gave off, and most of the time we were at about T8 and used some neutral density filters to control exposure. And one thing we found out fairly early on is that driving on the salt flats was surprisingly smooth. So we actually used that to our advantage, and I wanted to get some really wide establishing shots of this location, almost an aerial type of perspective. So I would just hang out on the top of the car and Marika would drive around, and the footage was actually really stable. I shot in slow motion just to be safe. I really enjoyed this footage, and this entire trip in general was a lot of fun. Great location to experience. We went out there at night and just got some shots of Pete with a flare. The moon came up just over the mountains behind the salt flats, and it was just a really fun experience. Great footage, and overall a successful first shoot. Next, we moved on to building the set. And this was something that we had zero experience doing. And really, I just wanted to build one hallway, one completed hallway of the spaceship that we could use as sort of a multi-purpose set. It really just started out with building the frame. We started out with a bunch of 2x4s, and we broke it down into 8-foot sections, and there were 4 of them, I believe. So it's 32 feet long, 8 feet wide, 8 feet tall. And that was the frame. So then we put up the drywall. Then the next step was priming and painting the interior, and we used a really glossy white paint because I wanted it to be very reflective. So I really wanted to be in control of the lighting on this set. So in each 8-foot section, we cut out a little part of the drywall, then put in a light cover in about the middle of each of these sections. Then we bought a bunch of Home Depot lights and used a bunch of tripods and just set these lights along each of these 8-foot sections. But really the set, it wasn't that hard. The framing was the probably the most challenging part, and then everything else just took time. Really, it just came down to covering up everything that we could and making it look as good as humanly possible. It looked a lot better on camera than it did in person. When you were there in person, it did not look good at all. We threw a green screen at the end, and it worked out for the shots we were trying to get. It probably took about a month total to build the entire thing, but there's only 2 or 3 of us working on it at one time. It could have been done a lot faster if we had more people working on it, and if we knew what we were doing. I think if we had to go back and build another set, it would come along a lot quicker than this first one. This is our first time doing it. So then for the second block of filming, we went to this location in Astoria, Oregon. There used to be an old military bunker complex. It's been abandoned for a long time, but they were nice enough to let us film here. And this sequence was a lot of fun to film in that it kind of allowed us to go back to our grassroots style of filmmaking. And it was fun to have a little action scene where Pete could do his own stunts. Pete and I have made movies since we were kids, and we'd always do stuff like this. You know, we'd be jumping around, doing our own stunts, fight scenes. For the scene where Pete slides down at the end and shoots about 4 guys in a row, we're not exactly professional stuntmen, so we had to do this scene probably 10 times. Pete had to slide down and then go back around, go back up to the top, slide again. And I'm surprised it even worked because we were splicing together about 10 different takes.
2, go. Careful. Whoa. Wait. Pete, don't go as high. We don't need it as high.
Okay.
Just go, Go right out from where you're at right now and just go down. Ready? Go.
No, let's try it again.
Let's see.
Slow-mo? Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna speed it up. You know. Okay, cool. Cool. That's cool. Not nearly as cool as, we could do it in 2 shots. How many can go up the side? I need the Tokina. 3, 2, go! It's just too high of a fall, I think. Kind of. A little too much. You don't need to jump so high. 3, 2, go. And step back. Actually, Jamie, could you throw just a bit of this stuff to come down behind it? Ready? 3, 2, go, Pete.
We got everything we needed for the sequence except for the shot where Pete jumps and goes into the slide. Now this would have been difficult to pull off there because if Pete would have actually jumped onto this section of cement, really would have hurt, and then he would have started sliding down fairly fast. It was way too dangerous for what we were doing. So after the fact, we borrowed some wrestling mats and found a little section of hill where I could get the camera low enough that I could zoom into Pete and get just a shot of him running and going into a jump, because we needed that transition shot showing him getting ready to jump, and then I could cut to the shot of him landing and sliding. So we just did this a few times, and the weather was similar, the lighting was similar, the time of day was similar, and then it all came down to grading, and the sequence actually matched up fairly well. When it came to color grading, I tried to use all built-in effects and tools from Adobe After Effects or Premiere Pro. And my process for this project was a little different in that I color graded almost everything first and then exported those files so I had everything graded that I could then use in my final edit. And the file format that I chose to kind of archive all of this graded material in was QuickTime Photo JPEG. And the reason for that is that this is the codec that you pretty much export everything as when you're doing stock footage. And I figured that if this is good enough for 90% of the stock footage online, that it retains a great level of quality, you can render as 4K, it's a nice storing codec, but you can also drop it into a new project and re-render it again without losing much quality, and I found that to be true. And so that's what I did. I color graded everything first and then archived it into subfolders so that when it came time to edit together the scene in the episode, everything was already graded, and that really sped up the editing process. As far as the actual grade, I tried quite a few things out, but like I said, I used pretty much all built-in tools from Adobe After Effects. So let's just jump into one of these shots and just kind of look at my workflow. With Red Epic files, you can change the gamma and the color space to pretty much whatever you want while in editing, but I mostly worked out of Red Log Film, which is a flat gamma curve. And the first thing I would usually do is add the Cineon converter. So if you go to Utility, Cineon Converter, and then change it to log, first thing I would do is usually set the white point, and then I would mess around with the gamma, and then the 10-bit black point, just to add the right amount of contrast to the scene. And I pretty much just eyeballed it. I didn't want to crush the blacks and I didn't want to overexpose the highlights, and it just came down to fine-tuning these settings to get it close. But the main idea was I wanted to add quite a bit of punch to the shot, so I wanted to get it close to clipping, but not quite there. Then the next thing I would do is I would add a selective color effect. And if I had skin tones, I would spend quite a bit of time on the reds and the yellows. And this is a good tool to help make skin tones pop. But if I didn't have any skin tones, I wouldn't spend too much time on any of the individual colors, and I'd just move along to whites, neutrals, and blacks. So with the whites, if I still had some overexposed stuff, I would turn up the black point, and that just kind of flattens out the highlights. I wouldn't do it too much because it looks weird if you go too far, but just enough to bring some of that back. And then with the neutrals, I might add a little bit of cyan and bring up a little bit of yellow, and that just kind of gives it this warm look. And then finally to the blacks, and I would bring up cyan and bring down yellow. And you can see this sort of just tints the blacks of the shot. And I thought that added a nice tone to the darker parts of the image. And then another tool that I relied heavily on was CC Toner. And this is only available in After Effects. And you add this to your shot, and then you change this to Pentatone. And then I would go through and change the color of each individual thing to kind of match it to the scene. So I might change the shadows to a more blue, and then bring a little more color to the midtones, bring down the highlights a bit, and mess around with the brightness of each one of these. And then just bring up the blend with original to anywhere from 75 to 90%. And this just added some nice rich tones to everything. So that's looking pretty good, and that's just with 3 effects. Then I would add an adjustment layer, make a square mask, and then bring back the expansion of that mask and feather it a bit. And then I would sharpen my image. And the reason I do the mask is because if you add the sharpening effect, sometimes you get some ghosting on the edge of your frame. So I would just add the sharpening effect and turn it up to about 20, just because Red Epic footage can stand to be sharpened quite a bit. Then I would add a black solid, do an elliptical mask, set that to subtract, feather it, and then change the opacity around, and there I have a little bit of a vignette. So I might move this to 15% or something like that. And there we go, we see the before and after, and that's a pretty quick and easy grade, not using too many tools. Everything's built into Adobe After Effects. And that was more or less my workflow for just about every shot. So like I said, I would export everything into QuickTime Photo JPEG files and stored them on external hard drives so that when it came time to edit, I had everything graded and I could see how everything was going to look right then and right there. And for the final YouTube cut, I did not add any film grain because in my experience, film grain gets lost in the YouTube compression and ends up looking just like compression artifacts. So the YouTube cut is actually completely clean. It's denoised with no grain added, and I just wanted to go for that sharp, crisp look. So that pretty much covers the grading process. It was actually fairly simple. No crazy plugins, just everything within After Effects, grading by eye and just working with the footage and bringing the most out of it. The visual effects for the beacon were always this looming presence waiting for me in post-production that I didn't want to address. But after enough procrastination, there came a time where I had to face my fears. Given the fact that we wanted to do almost everything in this ourselves, within reason, visual effects were going to be one of those things. And so the opening montage of Pete's character traveling to all these different planets and testing the atmosphere and looking for a habitable planet, that was a big challenge. And it was a big challenge to film, but then I started to think of the visual effects of it and it became pretty daunting. Let's just jump into a few of these shots. First things first, this opening scene, it's sort of a solar eclipse type of shot. So this is mostly just a 2D shot. We're not using three-dimensional objects. They're 2D flat photos, essentially. You can make this work if your camera moves are also 2D camera moves, side-to-side movement, up-to-down movement, or zooming in and zooming out. For this one, I found that having the subject in the direct center of the frame and zooming into it, you really couldn't tell too much that it was a 2D object. With all these shots, I like to start from the back and work forward. So what I mean by that is I started with my star field and I used some stock elements for this. So I purchased this Milky Way star photo from photodune.net. And essentially the first step was just dropping this photo into an After Effects composition. And I just created my composition as 1920 by 817, making it 3D, and then pushing it back in Z space quite a ways. And then scaling it up to fit this composition. Then the next layer, let's just move up. The next layer is this pretty cool stock video clip I got from Video Hive, and it's just this clip of a sun. And it's rare that you find animations like this on stock sites, but I really just liked the way the fire looked and the lighting. So I dropped this into my composition, made it 3D, moved it back into Z-Space, and then I took the eraser tool. Since setting this to screen and trying to get it to blend in with the stars didn't really work, I used the eraser tool and I kind of just erased this glow from the outside. So that was more just glow right around the sun, but not in the whole frame. So we have our Milky Way background, the sun, and now we move into our first Video Copilot element layer. So you add a black solid and you add Video Copilot element, and I just used their stock dead planet model. And you just click on that. To really get it starting to match, I took a screen grab of my scene with the stars and the sun, and I made that my environment. So if you take a JPEG, or if you have a JPEG, you go to this environment up here and you load from file, navigate to the JPEG, and you hit OK, and it will reflect your background and help make it look a little more realistic. So then it really came down to lighting and trying to match the scene to this planet. And really what I have been using for all the visual effects is, if you go down to render settings in Element and bring down lighting, you can choose different lighting setups, which is really fun to mess around with. But the one I had been using the most was just the dark setup, which was it created a lot of contrast. And then you mess around with the X rotation, the Y rotation, the Z rotation to get the light rotated to a point where it looks kind of realistic. When I think of a realistic photo of a solar eclipse, you can't see much of the planet. It's just this black ball. So we've got our planet, we got our sun, we got the star field. Then for the camera move, I added a 3D null object, then a camera. Then I parented the camera to the null. I simply keyframed a move in Z-Space to zoom in on this planet and also do a slight rotation in Z-Space. So I rotated the camera from 10.5% to 0 over time. With visual effects, I think the key is color correction and matching everything to make it look like it's all part of the same scene. And I find that vignettes go a long ways in doing that. And for the vignettes in this episode, I've been just using a black solid, creating a circular mask, feathering it, and then setting it to subtract. And then just changing the opacity to varying degrees depending on the shot. You know, this shot is pretty simple from a visual effects standpoint. It all came down to combining the elements and grading them to make them look like they're part of the same scene. And a big part, again, of doing that is adding glow. I found the built-in glow effects in After Effects have done a lot of the heavy lifting as far as making shots look like they're believable. And for this one, I added 2 glow effects. One of them was more like overall glow for the shot, just to give it kind of this vibrance. And then the other one was more for the lights in the scene to have a little glow around them. The glow for the sun itself, I wanted it to kind of have this vibrating glow, you know, in the background you can see the fire just, you know, morphing and moving. And so I wanted the glow to replicate that. I did a simple wiggle expression. You just alt click on the glow intensity. You just type in wiggle, parentheses, number, comma, another number, parentheses. First number is how many times a second you want this value to change. So this is the glow intensity, and I wanted it to change 2 times a second, and then a comma, and then the second number in this value is how much you want it to change, and I wanted it to change very little, so I put 0.01. So the glow intensity will change 0.01 2 times every second. And so you really just get this subtle shutter in the background to match what the sun's doing. Then just a little selective color to change the yellows of that sun to a more red. And then one last step was adding Video Copilot's heat distortion plugin to kind of make it look like this planet is really hot. I wanted to have this heat distortion effect around the edge of the planet. So I simply just duplicated the layer, the color corrected layer, and then added this effect, drew a mask around the edge of the planet and feathered it just so that I had this effect just kind of glowing on the edges of this planet, making it look like it's really hot. And that's it. Pretty simple visual effects shot, all 2D elements, just using color correction and just throwing all this different stuff at it to combine all the layers and make them look like they're part of one scene, I think helps sell the effect. And it honestly just takes time, you know, it's not gonna look great in the first half an hour that you're working on the shot, but if you put a couple hours into it, eventually you're gonna get it looking decent. So that is the opening shot. Now let's move on to a couple of the other visual effects shots. The next shot I want to talk about is this wide establishing shot of that hot planet. And these two shots right here don't actually include a lot of visual effects per se. So first things first, let's talk about how we filmed it. We were over at the Oregon coast and we had the spacesuit for another day before we had to send it back. And we have these really cool sand dunes over in Florence, Oregon, to act as one of the planets that he's testing out. Pete couldn't actually make it over to the coast at that time, so Marika actually put on the suit and stood in for these shots. So we just walked around a little bit and got some shots of her testing the atmosphere, and I made sure to get a couple wide shots where the camera was locked down because I knew that I might want to cut out some of this shot and place it somewhere else. So we have those shots, and then as we were leaving, we had to stop and get gas. And right there in the parking lot, there were these sand dunes just a little bit away that have kind of eroded in a visually interesting way. So Marika and I jumped out and I started getting these shots with the Epic. I put it in slow-mo mode and I was shooting, I think, in 96 frames a second. I first started with the 28mm lens and I could see right away that this effect could work with the right lens in slow-mo. So I put on the Tokina 11-16. I started moving the camera around, flying it around a little bit, trying to mimic aerials, and it actually worked. And this was really surprising to me. So I didn't really know what I was going to do with that until I got back home and I started to stabilize the footage and color correct it. And I was able to see that these shots would work for wide establishing aerials of an alien planet, and that just blew my mind. It was a spur of the moment thing, and it actually turned out that doesn't happen very often. So really we just ended up using two of those shots in the final cut. One of them is just a standard aerial. I just simply stabilized it, graded it, and then added some of that Video Copilot heat distortion just so that you know that this is the same planet we saw the opening shot of with the solar eclipse. I wanted to tie those two together. And then the second shot isn't an aerial, but I did take a still frame from one of the shots, and that's kind of the beauty of shooting in 5K resolution, is that I was able to just take a still frame. The point at which I paused this shot, it actually looks like a huge cliff. So then we go back to the shots we got of Marika in the suit, and I simply just cut her out of one of those shots and strategically moved her around in this background plate until I found a spot that it looked like she matched. Then I simply feathered and color graded and clone stamped until it looked like it matched fairly well. And so I thought this just showed off a completely different technique of visual effects that we used in this intro, and the results look pretty good. So the next shot I want to look at is this shot outside the planet with the asteroids kind of in the foreground. And first things first, we'll go with the star field. This is the same star field I used for the opening shot, but I wanted to use it in multiple scenes and not have to keep using different starfield shots. So I went into Photoshop, and this stock photo was originally like 3.5K or something like that, but I wanted to turn it into a huge starfield that I could put back in Z space, scale it up, move it around, and use it for different shots. So I went in and I clone stamped and made my own 10K version of this photo, and this was kind of my starfield backdrop for most of these shots. With this one, I just tried to scale it up, push it back in Z space quite a ways, and that's again the kind of the benefit, is I could push it way back in Z space, scale it up, and move it around to a section that I hadn't used yet, and it still looked like it was fairly high quality. So then we move into the dead planet again from Element 3D, and once again I went with the dark lighting setup This is one of those things where I came back a little later and did further adjustments after I added the asteroid field. The asteroid field was kind of the most important point of the shot to me. So once I perfected that, I went back and kind of made little tweaks on the planet to make sure it matched with the asteroid field. Just added a little bit of glow to the dead planet, and then just duplicated that layer and created a moon that was pretty much similar. I rotated the model a bit. The section of the planet that you're seeing light on, you're not seeing the same texture on the moon. I wanted it to look at least like it was a different planet. So I rotated the planet a bit. And the one thing I wanted to make sure of is that the lighting should have been exactly the same on the moon as it was on the planet. Then this overall cloud effect, I took this stock photo of a nebula and set it to screen and messed around with the opacity and just kind of really had this light layer of cloud. I think it had the opacity to like 5%. And I just messed around with it until it looked like it was this little dust field around this planet. Then this rotating star field up on the right, that is another stock photo, but it's a 2D photo. And one thing that I did quite a bit in this episode is I used the liquefy tool to animate stuff over time. And you can use this, it's right under the effects and distortion. It's called liquefy. And you can take this little swirly tool here and you can turn up the brush size and the brush pressure and click a few times on this 2D layer and you'll see it starts to swirl a bit. And so I clicked on that a few times, and then you go down to the distortion percentage. You turn it down to 0 and you keyframe it to go from 0 to 150, 200% over the entirety of your shot, and it animates into that distortion animation. So it actually gives it this swirling sort of like black hole effect that I really liked. So I added some glow to this thing. I distorted it and had it twirl around and made it 3D and set it back there in 3D space back behind the planet. And this was kind of our lighting source too. So again, going back to what I was doing with the planets, I tried to rotate the lights of the planet to match where this is pointing from. So it looks like that's where the light's coming from in both color, intensity, and position. That was key. Moving on to the asteroid field. So I'm gonna go ahead and add element 3D, go to scene setup. And again, you have a few models that ship with it. So you got Rock 1, Rock 2, Rock 3. Rock 2 seemed like it had the most detail. So I went with Rock 2. You turn off draft textures, and it's a pretty good little model. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's not bad either. Then you go ahead and hit OK. And so to start, there's only one asteroid. So you open up group 1, you open up particle replicator, and this particle count slider can actually control how many asteroids you have. So let's turn that up to 100. It still looks like there's only one, but that's because we need to spread them out. We need to make them random. We need to randomize the rotation and all this different stuff. So the scatter slider, as I turn this up, all the asteroids are starting to scatter away from this one point. So we'll turn that up quite a bit. And one thing I might even do is animate this scatter value over time so that the asteroids are kind of scattering apart from each other. So we'll set the scatter value at 300. And we will keyframe that value to go from 300 to 350 over time. So these asteroids really aren't looking all that realistic. So let's go down to the lighting and let's figure that out right now. So go to render settings, lighting. And again, I'm going to use the dark lighting setup, and already that makes it look quite a bit better. But let's rotate it just a little bit so it's even more backlit. There we go, perfect. That wasn't much at all, just -24 in the Y rotation. And let's bring brightness multiplier down to 50%. There, that's looking pretty good. So now one problem is that all the asteroids look fairly similar and it looks like they're just duplicated. So we'll go down to particle look and we'll open that up. And particle size we have at 10, that's pretty good, but let's change the particle size random, and that will randomize the scale of these rocks. And I think that's a good idea no matter what. Let's put that at about 60, but then bring up the particle size quite a bit. So we've got varying sizes of these asteroids. Let's push the whole replicator back in Z space. So back up to particle replicator position Z, and let's move everything forward a little bit so we have more asteroids in front of the camera. Back down to particle look. Now let's bring down particle rotation. And what we really want to focus on is rotation random XYZ. So we'll turn rotation random X up to, 50. Rotation random Y to 40. And rotation random Z to 25. And so as you can see, actually I liked what rotation random Z did. Let's put that up to 75. So as you can see, that rotates each and every particle, which is an asteroid in this shot, to a random spot. So we're seeing a different side of the model in almost every one of these asteroids, which really just helps sell the shot. It makes it look like we're not looking at the same model, because technically we aren't. We're looking at different sections of the model. So now just randomize angle, and let's just mess around with this a little bit. We'll go 10 on X rotation, 5 Y rotation, 15 Z rotation. The last thing to do is to have them rotating randomly individually. One thing to randomize the rotation is this rotation random up at the very top. If we animate this over time, let's set a keyframe at the very beginning and have the very beginning be 0. And then over time, let's have it animate to 25. And let's push the first keyframe back away so that it's already started when the shot goes. And let's play through this. And now you can see each one of these asteroids is rotating randomly, and that's exactly what we want. The lighting looks good, and now it just comes down to color grading. So right now the asteroids look like they don't belong in the same scene because there's not as much contrast as everything else. So that just comes down to adding a curves adjustment and bringing down the overall exposure and the gamma to match the background. And I also wanted to add a little camera lens blur because I felt like the models were a little too sharp. So I added a camera lens blur and turned on repeat edge pixels and set the blur radius to about 3. Then it just came down to adding glow, then vignette, and then some blue shadows, blue midtones, and then just brought down the gamma of the overall shot a little bit. So I think that's really the fun part, is once you do all the hard work, then you can go in and you can have fun with it, and you can add your 3D camera and you can move the camera around this scene and really just get cool angles and zoom it in and zoom it out and really have fun with it. And so that's what I did. And I actually did this composition in 4K, so I'm surprised that my computer was even able to handle it, but it did fairly well. It rendered out in about 2 hours each time, and I was able to render out a few different takes of it. But essentially, just like all the other visual effects I've talked about so far, it came down to lighting, color grading, and just knowing a little bit of Element 3D, but really, to make the scene look realistic, it came down to lighting and color grading once again, just like all the other shots we've looked at. So now I want to move on to the shots with our spaceship, the Kepler 613. Now this model was actually created by our concept artist, Steve Southern. He came up with the concept for this spaceship, and the idea was that we definitely wanted it based in reality and not too over-the-top sci-fi, but also to have some futuristic elements to it. So Steve did the original concept art, and he's also a 3D modeler, so he gave us a 3D model of the ship, and he sent me a .obj version of the spaceship, which I can load right into Element 3D. So for all the shots with the spaceship, I added the star field again, made it 3D, pushed it back in 3D space, scaled it up, then added a black solid with Element 3D and loaded up this Kepler OBJ spaceship file into Element 3D. The biggest challenge with these shots was choosing the materials for the spaceship. So the file that Steve sent didn't have any materials attached to it in Element 3D. Since we're using Element 3D, we had to go in and do this ourselves. So I messed around with a lot of different materials and shaders before I settled on one. And part of it had to do with it being reflective. I wanted it to almost have a
predator sort of cloaking aspect to it, so it would be very reflective, but also not too reflective. I didn't want it to look like a mirror flying around out in space. It took a while to fine-tune that, and I actually ended up using a few different materials and shaders for different scenes. For now, I'm just going to use this stock black shiny material, and I'm just going to double click on it, and we'll add that material to all of the different sections of this Kepler object. And I'm going to turn off draft textures, go to environment, and load up our star map so that the Kepler will be reflecting our star map. That's very key. So we'll load up the Galaxy 1 JPEG, then hit OK, and there we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a 3D camera, choose the camera tool and hold right click and zoom in, just kind of rotate around this thing. As you can see, we're already working in 3D space. And as I rotate around, you can see part of the problem that I started to run into with this is my 2D star map only went so far. So actually what I ended up doing for some of the shots where I would rotate very far around this model, I would copy my space background and zoom out a little bit here and rotate it and then move it around in Z space a little bit until I had almost a box of this star map surrounding. It helps if you go to the top view and you rotate this so that it's perpendicular like that, then move it around, and then we'll go back to the active camera. You can see right here behind we have a little bit of a seam, so we will create a mask around this second star map that we copied and pasted, and we'll feather this a bit. We'll actually take the mask expansion back and feather it even more. And that just gives us a star field so that if we do take the camera and we want to turn it all the way up until we almost get all the way around to this side. And it doesn't look great, but the idea is that if you zoom in the camera enough and you rotate around, you'll have this star map in almost a 360 degree view. And that, I mean, that's a very quick setup. And again, just like the other shots, once you get the model sort of set up and you get the background all in place, so you have flexibility to rotate the camera pretty much anywhere you want, then it's just a lot of fun to go in and animate these cameras and have them flying around and getting different shots. Then it just comes down to color correction, adding a vignette. You can render out this shot and then go back in and just reset the keyframes on your 3D camera and do a completely different move. So not much to this one. It's mostly about having the model and then getting your scene set up. I had a lot of fun doing this part of it. It kind of just allows your imagination to run wild as far as what kind of shots you can get. And it just comes down to a different star backdrop and planets and different stuff like that, different lighting, and you can make a totally different scene relatively quickly.
So now I want to talk about some of the visual effects in the simulation sequence. So first off, let's go ahead and just take a look at the muzzle flashes and the gun. The bullet is essentially, or the laser, right about when Pete got ready to fire. If you go to Effect, Generate Light Rays, you'll see you have this little ball of light that you can move around the screen and animate. So I started out when Pete was about ready to shoot, and I would keyframe the center for a few frames. I'd just go forward, move the keyframe, and I'd give myself about 3 frames to fade this thing in to the point where he shot. Then I'd animate it to go all the way over to my character and then fade out 2 frames. So I'd only keyframe this light ball for about 5 frames total. Then I'd go back to the first frame and I'd bring down the intensity all the way to 0, and I'd bring it up to 100 right when he fires, maybe a little higher than 100, so it's pretty bright right there. Then I would also turn off color from source, and that just turns it into this really bright ball. So as you can see, it sort of fades in and then fires at my character, and once it hits him, I would bring back down the intensity a little bit again to 90 or so, and then have it fade all the way out. So it's just this little light ball. You can even turn on motion blur It looks a little more like a laser. So there's our ball of light, and then I would add one of our custom-made lens flares to fade in just at the point that Pete fires this gun. So we'd start at 0 opacity here and go to 100 and then fade out, and then I would just keyframe the position of that to match the gun. So we've got the light ball and the lens flare. Then I would pre-compose that, then duplicate the layer, and right around the time that the gun fires, I would draw a few masks around Pete and some of the walls and some different areas just to simulate the change in lighting when the gun fires. So I'd add an exposure effect to the top layer, bring it up to like 1 or so. Then I just started drawing a few masks around Pete and around this wall by him. And I would feather each of these masks. And then I would keyframe the opacity to be at 100 when he fires the shot and 0 when it's fading in. So you're pretty much just lighting up the scene and trying to mimic how it would actually behave with that ball of light showing up in the scene. So that's looking pretty good. Now I would combine those layers, and again, Control Copy, Control V, and to this top layer, I would add the Video Copilot heat distortion effect. Then I would draw a mask around the gun, and I would feather this mask and then change the opacity just so that surrounding the laser and the light, there's this sort of like heat effect, and I really thought that added quite a bit to it. And then for the point at which it hits my character, I added the Video Copilot Action Essentials powder hit. I just added 2 of those, and I just motion tracked them onto the character as he was falling down, and I made them pretty small and brought down the opacity quite a bit to like 5%, just so there's a little powder hit on the character when he gets shot. Nothing too crazy. The last step is then I would pre-compose everything, and then I would have some pretty violent camera shake right at the point when Pete fires the gun. And that's pretty much it for the guns. Most of it just built around that light ray effect right in After Effects. Pretty cool little tool that you can use to simulate a laser or something like that. And then actually it's funny, for this scene, we only had one costume for the sort of bad guy AI unit. And I was playing each of these characters, so for a few of the scenes, we locked down the camera and I went through and I acted out like 4 or 5 different takes of these guys, especially for this wide shot showing all 5 guys in this bowl. And we've done that before. We did it in the Dark Knight Chronicles. I always enjoy doing little things like that and making it work with a small cast. We needed more characters, and so we just used some basic visual trickery to pull that off. You just make sure, if you're trying to do a shot like that, that the camera's locked down, and then your characters that you want to duplicate don't really intersect with each other. You can do that. You just have to rotoscope the characters. It can be done, but for this one I didn't really feel like doing that, so I made sure with each actor or each take I was doing as one of these bad guys, I didn't go too close to the other one. So that's pretty much it for the simulation scene. The sound design in this episode wasn't a huge deal just because we were featuring the music so heavily, but there were certain aspects to it that were going to provide a challenge because we knew we needed a few unique sound effects for both the spaceship and the gun. And for both of these sounds, I had something in mind to start out with, and I couldn't come up with anything in real life to record that could replicate the sound that I had in my head. So what I ended up doing for both the gun sound effect and the spaceship was recording my voice, attempting to make the sounds that I had in my mind. Okay, so now I am actually going to attempt to create sound effects for a spaceship using my mouth. Just my mouth. That's right. There we go. Sounds like exhaust. Then it just came down to bringing all of these sound effects into Adobe Audition and editing the hell out of them. Dropping the pitch, going crazy with the EQ, adding distortion, reversing it, slowing it down, speeding it up, panning it from left to right, and just trying to mechanize the sound that came out of my mouth to take it as far away from a human voice as possible. 80 to 90% of the sound that you're hearing in the gun and the spaceship is actually my voice trying to create those sound effects from scratch. The music in the first episode of The Beacon was a huge deal, and it was one of the first things we started working on. Some of the songs you hear in the prologue are about 2 years old at this point. For the opening song, we actually recorded Marika's vocals. She's been a singer for a long time, and she's always wanted to put her voice to some of our movies. We just really hadn't had the opportunity to do that up to this point. But with this opening scene, it made a lot of sense, and the vocal work she did is going to end up playing into the main theme going into the rest of the series. For this part of the tutorial, I actually want to take an inside look into one of the songs in the prologue called Nebula, and it's the song that plays at the end of the episode as Pete finds the habitable planet. So let's take a look at my Pro Tools project, and I'm running Pro Tools 8 LE, and I use a variety of samples, which I will get into shortly. Let's go ahead and mute all of the tracks in this project. Now this is an early draft of this project, and after this point I went through and I fine-tuned everything, I mastered it, added a few different instruments just to accentuate it, but these are the core instruments that made up the song, and this is what I want to take a look at. So let's just solo this first instrument, and this is the first thing that I wrote for this song. So let's just go ahead and play through this, and I'll talk a little bit about it as it's playing. This is a legato cello from East West Hollywood Strings. Their string samples are some of the best around. The sound is really deep, really full, and the goal with this song in general was to kind of capture both the beauty of space and the terror. And when you think about space, it's really true. Looking out at the stars, they can be one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen. Space can also be lonely, it's desolate, it's cold, it's dark, but it's also full of light, and it's amazingly beautiful. It's infinite, it's vast, and it's mind-blowing. That sort of is represented with just the simplicity of this cello line. And to push that even further, it all came down to reverb. I wanted to add a big space to this song, and adding reverb to the instrument really just did that. If I turn off the reverb, you can hear how flat and dull the sound is. And so I added the Carlsbad Caverns 3 reverb and turned it up quite a bit. And then turned up stereo double to the left. You can just hear this really gives sort of a dreary, drawn out, almost sad cello drone that fit perfectly for the shots of space. So that's our first track, and to complement that, I wanted to do something almost identical, but on the more beautiful side. So I chose from the first violins of Hollywood Strings, another legato, and this one takes a slightly different path to the cello so that it complements it, but it's also different and it takes a little more of a happy route. So you can hear, again, added the Carlsbad Cavern reverb just so that it really adds a depth and a space to the strings. And so when you combine the cello and the violin, you get this sort of yin and yang beauty and terror and loneliness kind of at the same time, and they're weaving in between each other. And I really like the simplicity of it. It's not a complex song at all, but the notes and the way they interact really just brought some emotion out as I was writing it, and it just seemed to work for the idea of space and nebula. And so those are our main instruments. They're kind of leading the song. And after that, it came down to filling that out. I didn't really want it to be too aggressive. So instead of having traditional percussion or a bass line that really just kind of drew away from the dueling cello and violins, I wanted to just add a long build and sort of just a building drone to the background. So I used the second violin harmonics from East West Hollywood Strings. I'll play through that now. And it just sort of builds over the course of this song. And it builds up to a nice little crescendo that, when combined with the cello and the first violin, it does the job of a bass line, and it sort of adds a depth to the song. So that's our build and our main instrumentation. And with these four instruments, I really wanted the ending to rise and to have a big climax. So right at the end of the song, I actually keyframed the volume on all four instruments to rise quite a bit up to a big finish. And you can hear that right at the end of this, how it sort of accelerates to the end of the song. Then I wanted to add a little bit of sound design and mystery, because up to this point I had pretty much only used traditional orchestral instruments. So I wanted to add different instrumentation, some sound design that could give it a different feel in the background. So I used 8 Dio's ambient guitars in the mystery folder, sample called Blue Rings, and it just has this really nice building atmosphere. I used the mod wheel over the entirety of the song to build from start to finish. So it starts out as this deep drone, and it eventually builds up to this crescendo, just like everything else in the song. Then I added East West, the Dark Side, instruments with effects, keys and strings, broken jaw harp. And this is another one that I animated over the entirety of the song to complement the crescendo of the entire thing. So we listen to everything together, and we have this really ethereal, distant, semi-beautiful, semi-sort of lonely feel to the song, with a little bit of futuristic alien technology floating around in the sound design. It's an extremely simple song. If you look at the notes that I'm playing, it's nothing crazy, but it's just in the way that it builds, and the notes that are used really ended up complementing the visuals that we used for the final sequence. So that more or less sums up the creation of episode 1. In between all of this, we had paid gigs, we have personal lives, but this episode, and even more so, this behind the scenes feature, has been our creative outlet for about the last 1.5 to 2 years. And after all of this work and all this effort, we're just now getting ready to do it all over again for the next few episodes. Filming begins on episode 2 next month. I hope you enjoyed this behind the scenes look into creating episode 1 of The Beacon. I'm Luke Neumann with Neumann Films, and thank you for watching.